On the foggy, early morning hours along the rugged coast of Normandy, Klaus Richter, a seasoned officer serving with the 25th Battalion of the German Artillery, awoke to a scene that was both familiar and eerily transformed. The world outside was shrouded in a light, damp mist that clung to the air, softening the landscape and cloaking the distant waters of the English Channel in an indistinct gray haze. The temperature was noticeably low, carrying that unmistakable crispness of dawn, infused with the salty tang of the sea and the dampness of wet soil, a scent that had become ingrained in the routines of wartime life for years. For him, this was just another morning, an ordinary start to what would turn out to be an extraordinary day, marked by the relentless rhythm of the watch, the unending wait for the unknown. As the first faint hints of sunrise struggled to breach the horizon, Klaus held his binoculars tightly, scanning the vast expanse of water before him. Suddenly, the peaceful surface of the sea began to alter in a way that defied all expectations. It was not a change caused by the usual shifting tides or a passing weather front. Instead, it was something utterly impossible to ignore. Where the ocean met the sky, a dark, extending line had appeared, a mysterious smudge that seemed to thicken, sharpen, and expand at an alarming rate. This was no ordinary fleet of ships or natural phenomenon. What he saw was a colossal structure, a city of steel and concrete that seemed to float invisibly out of the morning mist and into the annals of history. It was a vast, metallic metropolis, an enormous floating fortress that seemed to sail ominously toward the coast. Before any Allied soldiers had stepped onto those beaches below, and before the world had even learned the names of Omaha or Utah, Klaus realized with chilling certainty that the German military was about to face perhaps its most formidable challenge yet, the beginning of the end for Fortress Europe. To truly grasp the magnitude of that morning's shocking revelation, one must understand the context of the German defenses in mid-January 1944. From the icy fjords of Norway down to the mountainous terrains bordering Spain, German engineers had crafted an extensive, formidable barrier along the Atlantic coast known as the Atlantic Wall. This vast line of defense was comprised of reinforced concrete bunkers, heavy steel anti-landing obstacles, and a network of fortified positions bristling with artillery guns, machine guns, and other weaponry, all designed to serve as an impassable shield against any possible invasion. The German High Command and the persuasive propaganda they disseminated portrayed the Atlantic Wall as an unbreakable testament to the Reich's might, a physical manifestation of their dominance in Europe. However, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, an experienced soldier and war-hardened veteran of the brutal Eastern Front, understood the stark difference between how such formidable fortifications were portrayed and the brutal realities beneath the surface. At the age of 32, he carried with him memories of a different Germany, a nation more hopeful, more cohesive, before the war had worn down its strength and spirit. Yet, he was still young enough to have been shaped by the fires of combat, by the relentless grind of battle on the Eastern front lines, and by the sobering awareness of the uncertainty that lay ahead. Pragmatism was Klaus's guiding principle. He was observant, always noting the smallest details that could influence the outcome of their situation, and he was profoundly exhausted, worn out by years of relentless fighting and the weight of responsibilities he bore. His command consisted of an artillery battery, with solid, well-maintained cannons housed within reinforced concrete emplacements located just a few miles inland from the beaches designated by the Allies with code names like Omaha and Utah. From his vantage point in a concrete bunker embedded into a high bluff overlooking the sea, Klaus possessed a commanding view of the approaching waters, where every day he and his men carried out rigorous drills, calculating firing solutions, maintaining their weapons intensely, and steadfastly gazing out at the gray, featureless water. Throughout these endless days, conversations among the soldiers often centered on the anticipated invasion, referred to in military circles as Operation Overlord, and specifically the planned assault date known by the codename Der Day X, the Day of Destiny. The question that haunted everyone was not just when the attack would occur, but more critically, where it would strike. German intelligence specialists were convinced that the main assault would unfold at the shortest crossing point, an invasion at Pas de Calais, since it offered the quickest route across the Channel. This area was considered a logical choice, especially since it was where the bulk of the German defending forces, the 15th Army, had concentrated their strength in the west. Normandy, by contrast, was largely viewed by the High Command as a secondary location, perhaps a diversionary effort or a minor operation meant to draw attention away from the real target. This misconception, however, proved to be a catastrophic misjudgment, one that was no accident, but rather the result of an ingenious Allied deception campaign called Operation Fortitude. Through a series of sophisticated misinformation, fake radio signals, dummy tanks, and phantom armies, the Allies successfully convinced the Germans that the main invasion was imminent at the Pas de Calais, leaving Normandy's defenses dangerously unprepared for the true assault to come. This strategic blunder meant that the defenders in Normandy, including units like the 64th Infantry Division, better equipped and more experienced than most in the region, were still only a shadow of the elite forces that had previously conquered France 4 years earlier. Klaus's division was composed of a mixture of battle-hardened veterans, many of whom had fought on the Eastern Front, alongside a large contingent of very young teenage conscripts and older reservists, all of whom faced a terrifying certainty that they might not survive the coming days. Yet, despite the bleak outlook and the tension that hung over them like a thick fog, Klaus remained calm and resolute, knowing that every moment could decide the fate of thousands and perhaps the entire course of history itself. Although they displayed bravery and a deep sense of duty, they could not be compared to the formidable stormtroopers of the year 1940. They were, rather, defenders, soldiers assigned the critical task of holding a defensive line that was stretched perilously thin over a vast expanse. The defensive structure known as the Atlantic Wall was far from an unbroken, impenetrable barrier. Instead, it resembled a fragmented patchwork. Many of its bunkers remained incomplete, and the minefields laid out along the coast were riddled with gaps and vulnerabilities. The immense distances involved meant that even a well-fortified position could be easily isolated or bypassed by the enemy. Commander Richter was well aware of these realities. He had observed the shortcuts that local farmers still used to cross the fields, shortcuts that created blind spots in the fields of fire and weak points in the defenses. His professional instincts told him that, despite the fortifications, the chances of successfully repelling a determined and well-organized assault remained slim. As the weeks leading up to June unfolded, the tension was almost tangible, a living force that permeated the entire region. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, charged with bolstering the defenses, had been a whirlwind of activity, commanding an aggressive effort to reinforce the beaches with millions of mines and thousands of jagged steel obstacles that soldiers fondly nicknamed Rommel's asparagus. Rommel understood an essential truth that the High Command in Berlin seemed to overlook or dismiss. If the Allies were not stopped on the beaches within the first 24 hours, the entire campaign in Western Europe risked unraveling. Once the initial wave of landings succeeded, Allied air superiority would unleash destruction upon any German reinforcements attempting to push through to the coastline. The first day, therefore, was the critical moment, an all-or-nothing juncture that could decide the fate of the Western Front. However, on June 5th, the weather unexpectedly shifted. A fierce storm swept in, bringing with it powerful winds and tempestuous seas. The German Meteorological Service issued confident predictions that opposed any likelihood of an invasion for several days. This forecast had a calming effect on many high-ranking officers, allowing them and their units to relax and lower their guards, believing the assault was indefinitely delayed. It was also the reason Field Marshal Rommel himself was absent from France during those tense days. He had traveled back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, thinking that the raging storm would serve as a natural barrier, keeping them safe from the impending attack. As dawn broke on June 6th, the routine atmosphere persisted among the defenders, including Artior, who was on watch in the early morning chill. The storm had recently passed, but the sea remained choppy and unpredictable. No one anticipated an imminent invasion, not until a sudden flicker in the distance caught Reuter's eye. He raised his sturdy Zeiss binoculars with practiced ease, focusing carefully to get a clearer view. His heartbeat, which had been slow and steady during his night watch, suddenly intensified, pounding fiercely against his ribs. What he initially mistook for a flicker proved to be far more alarming. Ships appeared on the horizon. Not a small patrol or a quick raiding vessel, but hundreds of ships, an entire fleet. And behind these primary vessels, a growing number of additional ships emerged, seemingly endless. RTOR swept his binoculars from left to right in a frantic attempt to take it all in. Everywhere he looked, the sea was no longer just a gray expanse of water. It transformed into a relentless, dark mass of ominous shapes. A cold wave of dread crept up his spine, an instinctive recognition that whatever was approaching was beyond any logical estimate or prior intelligence. It was akin to staring at a complex math problem with no solution in sight. For a long, agonizing moment, RTOR struggled to process what his eyes were revealing. The scale of the approaching fleet seemed almost an insult to the principles of logic and probability. German intelligence had estimated that the Allies might amass around 3,000 vessels for an invasion, a staggering number, to be sure, but still conceivable with immense effort. What RTOR was witnessing was something entirely different, something much more overwhelming. He attempted to count the vessels, but the task was futile. The number vastly exceeded his capacity to estimate. His instinct kicked in swiftly, and he began to categorize what he saw. He discerned the imposing silhouettes of battleships, their enormous forms dominating the fleet. Cruisers moved in formation around them, their armament ready for battle. Swarms of smaller, speedier destroyers circled the larger ships like wolves circling their prey, darting back and forth at dangerous speeds. What truly struck RTOR, however, was the seemingly endless stream of other vessels, landing craft of various shapes and sizes. They were packed so densely along the sea's surface that they appeared to be drawn together magnetically, like iron filings converging around a magnet. The sight before him was nothing short of apocalyptic, and the understanding dawned painfully that a full-scale invasion was now unfolding before his very eyes, with an immense fleet that defied all previous estimates and expectations. He blinked rapidly, rubbed his eyes with a trembling hand, and looked again at the horizon, hoping for some change, some hint of illusion breaking apart. Yet, no matter how many times he glanced in that direction, the scene remained stubbornly unchanged. Gradually, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the image before him became not clearer, but sharper, more defined, and in that clarity, it grew overwhelmingly imposing. The vast mass of ships stretched out endlessly. The number later confirmed to be close to 7,000 vessels, an enormous fleet assembled from no fewer than 8 different nations. This colossal gathering would forever be remembered as the most formidable amphibious invasion force ever assembled in human history. But for RTOR, it was not merely a figure on a report or a statistic to be recited. It was a living, breathing force that seemed to press against the very edge of the world, bending the horizon itself under its weight. It was a visible testament to an industrial might so immense that every prior understanding of warfare seemed rendered obsolete, outdated by the sheer scale and technological prowess of what was unfolding before him. Images of concrete fortifications came unbidden, Germany's walls of impregnable concrete designed for defense. Yet here, the Allies responded with ingenuity and strength, constructing a bridge of steel that spanned the water like a living, breathing artery of warfare. His hand, damp with sweat, clenched the field telephone with a shaky grip as he fought to maintain composure. "This is RTOR at Observation Post 4, he announced into the receiver, voice steady but tense. "I have visual contact with the channel. There are ships in sight." The voice that responded was wearied, dismissive, as if the image he was describing couldn't possibly be real. "We've received reports of only a few ships near Leuthen, perhaps a raid. Please stand by," came the clipped reply. But Reuter's voice pierced through the skepticism, strained with urgency. "No, you don't understand," he insisted, voice rising. "It's not just a handful. It's thousands, an entire armada stretching from one horizon to the other." The line fell silent for a moment, thick with disbelief. RTOR could almost imagine the man on the other end picturing him as a junior officer prone to hysteria, frightened by shadows in the dawn. For a moment, he hesitated, then a second voice, more official, came through. "Oberberleutnant, the commander in charge. The sea conditions are not suitable. Your reports are mistaken. Reuter's frustration boiled over. For God's sake, he yelled into the receiver, voice cracking under the weight of conviction. I am looking at it with my very own eyes. He slammed the telephone down in exasperation, a surge of helplessness washing over him. The reality was too enormous to accept readily, too impossible to reconcile with the official reports that insisted otherwise. Desperate, he reached for another line, this time calling directly to regimental headquarters to speak with his commanding officer. When the line was answered, his voice was urgent and unwavering. Sir, this is RTOR. The invasion fleet is here, about 10,000 ships. He was aware that he might be exaggerating, perhaps almost to the point of hyperbole, but in that instant, the figures he rattled off felt like nothing more than a mild understatement compared to what he was witnessing firsthand. The major on the other end responded with skepticism. RTOR, are you certain? What about the weather conditions? He asked, voice cautious. Reuter's reply cut through any doubt. Major, the weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, and it's sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire. His words carried a sense of undeniable truth, an authenticity born of direct observation. The truth was that the High Command's plans, meticulously thought out on maps and based on intelligence reports, were fast disintegrating before what was now an undeniable reality. Their carefully prepared scenario was being upended by the sight of that vast, seemingly endless fleet just a few miles away, an invasion in full motion. While RTOR kept his focus on the fleet, studying every craft and formation through his binoculars, the generals and officers in command back at headquarters remained fixated on reports of parachutists descending onto the land. They assumed those parachutes marked the beginning of the main assault, utterly ignoring the great mass of ships that sat just beyond their reach, dominating their field of vision but seemingly invisible to their tactical minds. No one, apparently, was paying attention to the sea, only to the land. RTOR, however, didn't wait for their orders or for the command to catch up with reality. Instead, he shouted out urgent commands to his men, his voice now a mixture of authority and desperation. His men, stirred from their routines by the commotion and the tense atmosphere around them, turned to face him with expressions that mixed awe and fear, a reflection of what he saw and felt. They witnessed the moment their drills ended and the impossible became real. Heavy shells were swiftly pulled from their magazines, the metallic clang echoing through the air, while the rangefinders blared out numbers, monstrous figures that seemed beyond any rational comprehension. The towering barrels of the cannons, silent for long months, began their slow, deliberate ascent, pointing their deadly tips toward that endlessly vast fleet. RTOR stood at his post, binoculars pressed against his eyes, his gaze fixed on the distant scene. He could see the landing craft starting to coordinate, forming into organized groups, preparing to carry men ashore. The air around him seemed to hum with anticipation, a low, constant vibration, the sound of thousands of engines working in unison, an acoustic signature of a superpower's breath. That sound, heavy and persistent, was the breath of an industrial giant, a colossal force capable of unimaginable destruction, and RTOR was on the brink of unleashing the first salvo. The moment was charged with undeniable tension, an inescapable convergence of man and machine, history and destiny, and he knew that with this action, the course of the entire conflict was about to change forever. The order finally reached just moments before 6 o'clock in the morning, signaling the start of a new phase in the relentless conflict. With that command, RTOR was liberated from the grip of stunned disbelief that had momentarily paralyzed him. A surge of clarity suddenly replaced the numbness. He was now fully engaged and prepared to act. Calmly and deliberately, he issued his orders to fire, the words bursting from him with a roaring intensity that matched the chaos around him. His voice cracked sharply into the telephone as he commanded his crew to their stations. Moments later, the earth beneath his feet trembled violently as the first artillery shells thundered into the water, marking the beginning of their attack. The initial shot was followed swiftly by a second, and then a third, as the shells screamed through the air, carving arcs over the vast waters. Through his binoculars, RTOR carefully tracked the trajectory of each projectile, a mixture of professional pride and mounting dread coursing through him. He observed plumes of water erupting amidst the fleet, small bursts spilling up like fountains of destruction. A shell missed its mark, then another, but his seasoned crew was quick to adapt, adjusting their aim with disciplined precision and firing in a well-rehearsed, rhythmic pattern. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if they had succeeded. Their fire found its target. RTOR clearly saw a direct hit on the American destroyer USS Corey. A brilliant flash of orange erupted momentarily, followed by a puff of dense black smoke rising into the sky. Some reports suggest the ship might also have hit a mine, but from Reuter's vantage point, it was clear that his guns had launched the first decisive blow, causing the vessel to list heavily, crippled, and ultimately sink. Cheers erupted among his crew, their voices rising in a surge of triumph. For a brief interval, it genuinely felt like they were engaged in a real battle, like their rigorous training, their discipline, and their effort had made a tangible difference, turning theory into reality. Yet, that exhilarating feeling was ephemeral, quickly fading as reality reasserted itself. After the USS Corey was struck, the fleet refused to retreat or fall into disarray. It showed no signs of distraction. Instead, it maintained its formation without slowing down, quickly filling any gaps that appeared in the line. The relentless columns of ships advanced unyieldingly, an unstoppable wave of iron and steel that threatened to drown everything in its path. Reuter's guns launched volley after volley, each shot a desperate attempt to halt the inexorable march of the enemy fleet. Still, for every ship they managed to harass or disable, hundreds of others continued their passage, seemingly untouched by the barrage. A wave of deep futility washed over RTOR, an overwhelming sense that he was trying to drain the ocean with a bucket. Despite the barrage of shells and striking measurements, he lifted his gaze beyond his own battlefield to see the larger scenario unfolding. The mighty battleships of the Allies, such as the USS Texas, had begun turning their colossal 14-inch guns toward the coast, their massive barrels aimed to deliver destruction on the shoreline. Then, the enemy responded. A distant low rumble spread across the waters, gradually rising in intensity. RTOR glimpsed flashes of light emanating from the giant warships, a silent, thunderous lightning storm on the horizon, illuminating the darkening sky. Within seconds, the very air around him seemed to tear itself apart, torn asunder by the relentless violence. The earth itself began to shake and heave as geysers of soil and debris burst forth from the fields behind the cliffs. It was as if the systematic, industrial effort to dismantle the Atlantic Wall had ignited into life, an unstoppable, destructive process now underway. Reuter's gaze instinctively searched the skies for signs of the German response, the anticipated counterattacks, the arrival of the armored divisions or aircraft, yet he saw none. Not a single German tank or plane was in sight. The skies above had been completely seized by the Allies. Fighters streaked across the air, bombers roared overhead, transports moved purposefully through the clouds. They had dominion over the sky. German military doctrine called for fierce armored counterattacks to push back the enemy, but the closest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was paralyzed by confusion and a troubling lack of direct orders from Hitler's command. When it finally moved, it did so without proper air support into a sky thick with Allied fighters and bombers, resulting in near-total destruction before reaching the front lines. At that moment, amidst the deafening roar of artillery and the sky raining shrapnel and steel, RTOR understood that what was unfolding was no longer merely a battle, but an extermination. The Allies weren't merely trying to outmaneuver the Germans. Their goal was to erase them entirely from the battlefield. That profound realization, that this was a struggle of overwhelming force rather than tactical finesse, became the defining truth of the entire Normandy campaign. The story of how the industrial might and sheer overwhelming power of the Allies ultimately overshadowed battlefield tactics is both complex and fascinating, reflecting a shift in warfare that would have lasting consequences. If you find yourself captivated by deep dives into the lesser-known and often overlooked facets of history, then this story is likely to resonate strongly with you. It's a narrative that reminds us of the intricate and often hidden realities that shape the course of major events, and it invites you to delve beneath the surface to discover truths that are seldom highlighted in conventional accounts. The journey begins amid the chaos and fury of a naval bombardment, an intense barrage that caused Reuter's mind to undergo a profound transformation. As the ferocity of the attack escalated, a strange shift overtook him. His strategic, tactical thinking abruptly shut down, replaced by a stark, cold, and almost terrifying clarity. No longer was he simply observing ships and soldiers engaged in battle. Instead, he was seeing the fundamental system that underpinned the entire operation. He was gaining an uncanny insight into the industrial backbone of the war effort, the factories that produced the machinery and weapons that made such a conflict possible. Through his trembling binoculars, Artior looked beyond the immediate scene, beyond the warships cutting through the water and the armed men braced for combat, and envisioning the vast manufacturing complexes of Detroit. He couldn't help but picture the endless assembly lines, the relentless churn of trucks, engines, and countless other military supplies being produced on a scale that German industries could only dream of matching. This realization brought a sobering understanding that the logistical nightmare of supporting an invasion, supplying hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile, foreign shore, was not an insurmountable miracle, but rather a straightforward consequence of intense industrial output. The entire military endeavor, which seemed so daunting on the battlefield, was underpinned by the simple but unstoppable force of industrial efficiency. He then cast his gaze upward, where the sky was filled with a seemingly endless stream of aircraft. Sinus-47 transport planes and fighter bombers streaming into the theater of war like a relentless river. Looking back at the D-Day invasion, Artior recalled that, during that critical day, the Luftwaffe had flown approximately 300 sorties across the entire nation of France. In stark contrast, the Allies had flown more than 14,000 missions, a staggering figure that demonstrated their overwhelming aerial advantage. For every single German aircraft in the skies, there were more than 40 Allied planes actively engaged in combat or support roles. This disparity was not attributable to a lack of courage among German pilots. Rather, it was a direct consequence of the industrial and logistical disparity, a gap rooted in the mighty factories behind the Allied war machine. Moving from the skies to the ground, Reuter's thoughts dwelled on the tanks, those armored behemoths that had once symbolized technological superiority. He knew well the formidable reputation of the German panzers, particularly the Tiger and Panther tanks, which were feared across the battlefield for their advanced armor and weaponry. These tanks had a reputation for being some of the most technically advanced and feared weapons in the war. However, he also understood that this supposed technological edge represented a strategic dead end. While individual tanks might have been terrifying and durable, their complex design made them expensive and difficult to produce in large quantities. For every fierce Tiger tank that rolled off German assembly lines, the Allies were mass-producing dozens of simpler, less elaborately designed but nonetheless extraordinarily effective Sherman tanks. In the course of the entire year of 1944 alone, the United States produced more than 29,000 tanks, a staggering output that dwarfed Germany's maximum monthly production, which never surpassed 2,000 units. This contrast revealed a crucial truth. The Allies' plan was not to rely solely on the superior quality of their tanks to secure victory. Instead, they intended to prevail through sheer quantity, overwhelming the German panzers with a relentless flood of steel. The strategy was to generate an insurmountable mountain of steel and firepower, rendering the German armored units less decisive in the grand scheme of the war. This realization signified a new and brutal reality, an industrial calculation that spelled defeat. All the passionate rhetoric about willpower, national resolve, and ideological strength evaporated in the face of these overwhelming statistics. Nazi ideology had long championed the idea that a united, determined people could triumph over what they depicted as the decadence and weakness of democratic nations. Yet, the shattering numbers told a different story, serving as stark proof that steadfast ideology alone could not withstand the relentless force of industrial production. A bomber plane, a battleship, or an entire army could not be defeated simply through conviction or moral resolve. The brute facts of production and logistics carried the day. In this moment of clarity, RTOR experienced a profound, almost spiritual despair. Despite their bravery and discipline, he reminded himself that he and his men were good soldiers. Yet, they faced a tragic and seemingly inscrutable fate. Their imminent demise was not necessarily due to a lack of skill or courage, but because they were so vastly outnumbered and outproduced on a scale that defied comprehension. They were part of a conflict that was already prejudged, a contest that was unreachable by mere effort or willpower alone. His entire German unit, and indeed the entire German military presence in the West, resembled a finely crafted sword confronting a gargantuan, steam-powered drop hammer, a mechanical device designed to crush anything in its path. The outcome of this brutal contest was predetermined. Victory was impossible. His thoughts drifted to the propaganda posters and the unwavering but illusionary belief back home, which clung to the hope of final victory. RTOR knew now that this belief was founded on falsehoods, not merely political propaganda, but on cold, hard mathematics. The high command in Germany was undoubtedly aware of the reality. They must have seen the production charts, the raw numbers, meticulously compiled and understood by analysts and strategists alike. Yet, despite this knowledge, they continued to send RTOR and millions of others into a war they could see was unwinnable. They had sacrificed countless lives, driven by a faith in victory that, in truth, was built on fragile illusions and unsupported by the stark facts of industrial capacity. The tragic irony was that the war effort was fundamentally doomed from the outset, not because of the individual heroism of soldiers, but because of the cold, inexorable laws of production and logistics that favored the Allies in the end. As the final year of the war approached, it became painfully evident that the psychological toll on those fighting at the front lines was reaching an unbearable peak. The relentless confrontation with an almost incomprehensible truth, an oppressive reality rooted in the ruthless machinery of war, began to take its toll, resulting in a disturbing rise in suicides among officers and soldiers alike. These individuals weren't merely engaged in combat against enemy troops from distant nations such as America, Britain, or Canada. They were also battling the overwhelming, often invisible forces of the global industrial complex. This vast, interconnected system of factories, supply chains, and war preparations had become an omnipresent and mighty adversary that seemed to possess a life of its own. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the boundary between the theoretical understanding of war's destructive capabilities and its brutal, visceral reality blurred beyond recognition. The once distant notion of constant bombardment tightened into an unrelenting, deafening symphony of destruction. The naval artillery assaults intensified, reaching an almost unbearable crescendo, transforming the sky and sea into a continuous rolling roar that refused to cease. The very concrete of the fortified underground bunker trembled beneath the barrage, and dust and debris rained down from the ceiling in a relentless shower, a testament to the relentless assault above. Through a narrow observation slit, RTOR watched as the first waves of landing craft reached the tumultuous shoreline. The landings were brutal and chaotic. Higgins boats, designed for such moments, dropped their ramps and disgorged American soldiers into the surf with a thunderous splash. Immediately, the sharp crack of machine gun fire erupted from the German pillboxes scattered along the stretch of Omaha Beach, ripping through the ranks of the men who had just set foot on the sands. From his vantage point, RTOR could witness the unfolding tragedy, the water turning a dark crimson hue as blood mixed with the surf, and the horrifying mountain of bodies piling up amid the chaos. The German 63rd Regiment, part of the formidable 352nd Infantry Division, was paying an unimaginably high price for its defenses, inflicting terrifying casualties on the invading forces. For a fleeting moment, it appeared that the Germans' stubborn resistance was holding firm. The Americans were pinned down, their advance seemingly halted by the well-prepared defenses. Yet, in war, the relentless machinery of industry and technology soon asserted itself once again. This dark equation of destruction continued to operate, revealing its brutal logic through acts of both daring and sacrifice. British and American naval destroyers, witnessing the slaughter and recognizing the desperate need for intervention, made a move that was as suicidal as it was heroic. They boldly steamed directly toward the shoreline, some coming within 1,000 yards of the beach, their hulls scraping on sandbars as they pushed through the chaos. With resolute determination, these warships aimed their guns at the fortified German bunkers, providing critical direct fire support that began to turn the tide of the fighting at Omaha. Simultaneously, a new wave of strange, formidable machines appeared on the scene. RTOR observed with a mixture of awe and curiosity as amphibious trucks, famous as the Dukus, seemingly drove straight out of the ocean and onto the beach, their presence a remarkable sight of wartime innovation. Tanks, some equipped with gigantic flails designed to detonate underwater mines, slowly crawled ashore, their tracks raking through the sand. These particular vehicles, known as Hobart's Funnies, were a specialized British development, crafted specifically to destroy defensive obstacles like minefields that the Germans had meticulously prepared. Unlike their German counterparts, the enemy lacked any comparable machines or innovations capable of countering this new level of mechanized assault. With each passing moment, the scene on the beach shifted from frantic struggle to an almost methodical, calculated process of devastation and annihilation. The German strong points, once formidable, were systematically blinded and destroyed through precise and relentless bombardments, naval shells pounding from the battleships, tank rounds ripping through concrete, and bombs dropping from aircraft overhead, all working in concert to obliterate the defenses. The scale of destruction was staggering. Estimates suggest that during that single day, approximately 1,200 soldiers from the 63rd German Regiment suffered casualties on Omaha alone. An astonishing proportion of the unit's fighting force was decimated within just a few hours, a grim testament to the ferocity of the assault and the relentless industrial power harnessed to facilitate it. Reuter's own artillery battery was now caught directly in the line of fire. Shells fell nearer and nearer with each passing second, their fiery explosions lighting up the darkening sky. A direct hit on one of his gun emplacements ignited a brilliant fireball that shot into the air, illuminating the chaos. Another gun was knocked out of commission, and the telephone lines that connected him to command suddenly went dead, severing his link to the wider battlefield. Isolated and vulnerable, his command was shattered, leaving him to face the rapidly changing situation almost alone. Looking skyward one last time, RTOR saw a majestic, moving ceiling of Allied aircraft overhead, a testament to the overwhelming air support that had become a crucial element of the invasion. Out at sea, the first wave of landing craft was being rapidly replaced by subsequent waves, a second and a third, forming a continuous, unending conveyor belt of men and equipment pouring onto the beaches. Beyond these waves, an enormous armada of ships and vessels waited patiently, their presence a silent, relentless force of nature. This vast fleet appeared to be capable of sustained operations indefinitely, a tangible demonstration of the immense logistical effort mobilized for the invasion. Remarkably, by that point in the battle, the Allies would eventually land the equivalent of around 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone, a staggering figure by any measure. Though the fighting at the beaches persisted fiercely, it was already clear that the war's outcome had been essentially decided. The key battles had tipped heavily in favor of the Allies. The only remaining factors to determine were the precise moment and the amount of destructive force, tonnage, that would ultimately secure victory. The fierce conflict in Normandy would continue unabated for another 2 months, extending the brutal struggle that had already lasted weeks. The combat was relentless, especially in the tangled hedgerows that crisscrossed the battlefield, where every clash was savage and costly in human lives and material. Despite the fierce fighting, however, the overall situation remained unchanged. No strategic advantage was gained, and the deadlock persisted. Each German tank lost in these skirmishes represented an irreplaceable loss, a machine that could never be restored to the battlefield. In stark contrast, every Allied tank that went up in flames was swiftly replaced, often by 3 new vehicles arriving to bolster their ranks. Meanwhile, every fallen German soldier created a void in the line that no reinforcement could easily fill, leaving gaps that threatened to unravel German defenses. For Lieutenant Klaus Richter, and for countless other German soldiers who had survived that initial, devastating day, The rest of the war felt like a tedious epilogue, an unending sequel to a battle already lost. These men continued to fight on, driven by a mixture of sense of duty, instinctual fear, or a misguided patriotism that had become disconnected from any tangible hope or future. The dream of victory had long since dissolved, evaporating like morning mist beneath the relentless dawn of June 6th. When reflecting on the fall of the Third Reich, one might imagine its collapse as a slow and agonizing descent into ruin, culminating in the fierce, destructive battle for Berlin. However, for those German soldiers stationed along the Atlantic Wall, the end came not gradually, but in a sudden, overwhelming burst of revelation that shocked them to their core. It was the moment they glimpsed the horizon filled with an immense fleet, the sky black with endless swarms of enemy aircraft, and an invading force that was more than just an army. It embodied the relentless, crushing power of the modern industrial age. This new form of warfare was unlike any previous conflict. It was not fought solely on the battlefield in hand-to-hand combat, but from factories and assembly lines thousands of miles away, where the true engine of destruction was forged. One German officer, gazing through his binoculars at the sea, which now seemed to turn to steel before his eyes, experienced a moment of chilling clarity. It was then that he understood. This was the beginning of the end, a turning point where the total might of modern warfare was laid bare and emphasized the magnitude of what was to come.